asked me to say a little bit about the arc of my own work. And so let me start maybe with my book, The Caste Question. Right. Say a little bit about that text and then what happened thereafter. What I'd really like to talk about is some of my current work, the interests that I have in thinking about the relationship between race and caste. So questions of what I call historical comparison, but as well to think through some of the broader sort of logics of where anti-caste thought sits within what has come to be called global intellectual history or Indian political thought, right? So the book, The Caste Question, which was published in 2009, had, I think, one particular aim, which at that time I think was distinctive. Now, keep in mind that, the conversation, indeed something like a well-developed world of writing around Ambedkar studies in English. Ambedkar has always had a long life in the local Indian languages, but something that we might call Ambedkar studies or a critical Ambedkar studies is taking shape and has been taking shape over the last decade or so. But when I wrote my book, there were two things that I maybe really wanted to push for. The first is an intervention within the scholarship on South Asian studies, and especially a challenge to the work of subaltern studies. So, I was trained in the 1980s and the 1990s, and the dominant school of thought really at the time, and the one that, everybody was drawn to, certainly those of us who were conceptually curious, and theoretically engaged and inclined, but also really wanted to think through the specificity of South Asia and what it had to offer more broadly, right, to global ways of thinking and knowledge making. That moment was really marked by the Subaltern Studies Collective. And so the Subaltern Studies Collective, of course, first posited the subaltern as a political subject, and the subaltern as a political subject who was constituted, created, if you will, through different relations of domination and subordination. It could be gender, it could be caste, it could be religion, right? It could be any number of frames of agonism, contradiction, or, as I said, elements of domination and subordination through which the subaltern was created. But there was also, at the time it seemed to me, a real, what might we call it, a privileging of the subaltern as a figure of cultural alterity. That is, largely the subaltern was conceived as a figure who was outside the state or challenged the dominant frames of the state. It ended up being, quote unquote, Adivasi subjects very often who were the sites, the scenes, and the actors, the actors of various political events who moved historical events along. And there was, of course, also, it seemed to me, an explicit failure to engage with questions of caste. And not questions of caste in the way that scholars had understood caste as a colonial category, a category that had been given a new life by the colonial state, as a bureaucratic identity, as a framework through which to understand social entitlement and social identity. But I was very interested, and I think this came from the particular perspective of Maharashtra and anti-caste thought and movement. I was very interested in thinking about what I called caste as the political unconscious of Indian society. That it was what gave purchase, pertinence, coherence to the very socio-political framework that enabled thinking. And so in that sense, caste was conceptually significant and it was constitutive of social relationships. And caste was both prior to and renewed by the colonial context in which we found ourselves. And so this twofold movement, so caste is what I will call a archaic or a pre-colonial remnant. That is, caste is both ancient and modern. And Ambedkar sort of talks about it in that way from his first text, 1916, Caste in India. Caste is both old and new. This was something that I was very keen to understand better, and also to think about caste as inherently both political, and that it was the wedge for understanding the particular histories of Indian democracy. So to the extent that the state, questions of the state, politics, the politics of the minority, the idea of franchise, the question of political emancipation, to the extent that those were fundamental questions, and again, recall that these are fundamental questions for someone like Ambedkar, right? To the extent that these were important, it really challenged the subaltern studies perspective in multiple ways, and I was very interested to do that. The second was the title of the book itself, The Caste Question. And I think people imagine that they know what the caste question is, or that there has always been a caste question in India. The way that I use the term the caste question was drawing very much on the way that Marx, in the Jewish question, talks about the Jewish question not as a question that can be solved, but as a question that has to be posed again and again in very different forms and frameworks, but that it is a question that haunts the ways in which we understand politics. So this question of sort of Indian political thought has to engage the question of caste as its internal constitutive element, right? And so the caste question is not a question that can be answered, but it's a question that has to be posed as a question of what is the conceptual place of caste for understanding the histories of Indian politics and indeed of Indian democratic thought. And there, I think Ambedkar as not just a movement leader, and we had lots of work on Ambedkar as a movement leader, his internal social reform, his activist engagement, his engagement through journals and periodicals and newspapers and so on, but to actually think about Ambedkar as a thinker. What did that actually mean? A thinker is someone who creates an internal logic and a sufficiency, to their mode of thinking. So a thinker is someone who creates an internal logic and a sufficiency, a self-sufficiency to their orders of thinking, to the concepts that they use, and they try to fine-tune their concepts and their analysis in a way that creates a kind of genealogy. We can see their work, we can see their writing as having a certain kind of systematicity. This doesn't mean that their ideas don't change. This doesn't mean that they take up new issues. I mean, certainly the young Ambedkar has a very different relationship, if at all, to the later Ambedkar who's thinking in and through the question of Buddhism. Right? So it's not that, people don't move, but there's a kind of consistent logic. And it seemed to me that in Ambedkar's thought, but also anti-caste thought in Maharashtra more generally, I draw on a term that my colleague at Columbia, Robert Gooding Williams, uses. He calls African-American thought, Afro-modern thought, he calls it a genre of political thought. Because it is a genre of political thought that is engaging consistently with a small set of keywords, concepts, and concerns. Right? And I think similarly, we see in anti-caste thought, and certainly in Ambedkar's own thought, this is a particular genre of political thought. It is concerned with the existential problem of untouchability, but it's engaged with the question of caste and untouchability as a form of social totality. Right? It is something that encompasses everything from the existential to the economic for Ambedkar. So this idea of caste is a very particular kind of totality which structures, it is the structuring structure, right, of how we approach the Indian social itself. This, I think, marks Ambedkar's thought. The ways in which he thinks about the question or the problem of democracy, the question of minority, which is very important for him. He certainly is drawing on other ways in which the question of minority was thought, especially the question of Muslim minority, but he produces a very particular understanding of the Dalit dilemma so far as politics is concerned, and the politics of emancipation, the politics of redistribution, and the politics of recognition. So I think Ambedkar here, and I suggested this in the Caste Question, opens up a problematic that does not have resolution. Right? That question has to be asked again and again. What is caste in the 1930s is very different from what caste is in the 1950s for Ambedkar, or the ways in which he understands untouchability as having a deep history. Right? And this, I think, is part of the question of thinking through a kind of problematic, thinking of caste as a peculiar and particular analytic and a problematic. So that's sort of where I began. I was also very interested in relating in that book, and I have been throughout, very interested in understanding the relationship between social thought and social history. Right? That is, the thought doesn't live somewhere up here. A lot of political thought and political theory tends to function as if thought is delinked from its social context and from its locatedness, its emergence through particular social political histories. And I've been very interested in thinking about this relationship between social thought and social history. And I think this has been a kind of running theme in the work that I've been doing. And it's in this context that maybe I can speak a little bit about the Ambedkar Initiative as well, and sort of what ends up happening once you engage. Of course, once you start thinking and engaging with Ambedkar, I think you can't let him go. He is vexing. He is sometimes enigmatic. He is powerfully persuasive. His modes of arguing and engaging are always both surprising and extraordinarily complex conceptually, right? So I think Ambedkar, that deep dive into Ambedkar that people have been engaging with, it's a collective work. I think we all have our own Ambedkars. We have many Ambedkars. There is the Ambedkar as a kind of socialist and somebody who's very engaged with the socialist problematic, if you will, of equality and emancipation. There is the Ambedkar who is seen as being part and parcel of a line of American pragmatism. There is the Ambedkar who engages both episodically, but also in quite interesting and intriguing ways with the questions of race and racial formation. That's the Ambedkar also that I find very interesting. And there is the Ambedkar of the welfare state. So as I said, just, there are many, we all have our Ambedkars, right? We all have our ways of reading Ambedkar. But one of the things that was very interesting to me always was, who was Ambedkar before he became Ambedkar in India? And here I think the question of the American Ambedkar becomes really interesting. I'm both lucky, but I think also bear a very distinctive responsibility. And it is one that I really wanted to embrace as well as I can, as somebody who comes from an upper caste family and really is not a Dalit scholar working on Dalit questions. And so I think that should be really underlined and amplified with everything that carries by way of historic responsibility, accountability, and also the question of structural position, where I speak from. But I've been very interested in who is the Ambedkar before he becomes Ambedkar. Who is he, for instance, in the United States when he comes there? Who is he at Columbia University? And as I said, because I happen to be at Columbia University, there's a particular responsibility for thinking about Ambedkar in America and at Columbia, and what that link is, right? So this is the world's quote-unquote first democracy. What the links are between the world's first democracy and the world's largest democracy, i.e. So what kind of an arc can be drawn between Ambedkar in the US and Ambedkar in India, and of course his many peregrinations in between? And there, I think the particular thing that I want to flag is the question of race and caste, because there are very interesting ways in which the race problem, as it's being addressed, and indeed the quote-unquote Negro problem, as it is being elucidated and articulated, especially by someone like W.E.B. Du Bois, is something, but of course other scholars as well of African-American thought, that the ways in which the race-caste problematic is emerging in that period is something that I'm very interested in. And to that extent, Columbia University is quite important, because Columbia, when Ambedkar was there, was undergoing a great efflorescence of thought, but also the disciplines as we come to know them, anthropology, sociology, political science, those disciplines were being formed, created at the university during the time that Ambedkar was there. So I think the time when Ambedkar is there is a very distinctive way in which what is called social politics and the social question, immigration, race, gender, and indeed caste, are coming up as ways for understanding sociological modes of thinking, anthropological modes of thinking. And so there's a very particular way in which Ambedkar, the university, and the United States in that period, I think, allow us to think about Ambedkar in a global frame. Ambedkar is always already a global thinker. And we've all, I think, been engaged in the process of making Ambedkar's work relevant to, as I said, global intellectual history. But he's always already global, because the context in which he's being trained within and without the university when he's at Columbia is a moment of a kind of extraordinary expansion in thinking about the social question. And I think that might be one way to think about the work of the Ambedkar Initiative. As I said, the other thing is the question of accountability and responsibility. The fact that I happen to be at that institution, I think, places a great deal of accountability for those of us who are there to enable new spaces, to create new spaces for emerging scholars, for Dalit thinkers and scholars especially, and to work on democratizing the university from within.